day and welcome to Alena Media TV. We are broadcasting from Toronto, Canada, and today we are going to give you editorial talking and fighting about self-determination in Ethiopia. Let's go for a quick break. When we come back, we'll get our editorial in details. Welcome back from that short break. Now, the political dispute that led to war in Tigray, Ethiopia, was sparked by contending interpretations of the right to self-determination in the country's constitution. Drawing on a themed collection in the January 2021 issue of Nations and Nationalism, Alex de Waal explores the diverse theories and practices of self-determination in the Horn of Africa, shedding light on the current conflict and why it will be so difficult to resolve. Ethiopians are fighting over self-determination. In the last few months, constitutional disputes over respective powers of the federal government and regional states have become full-scale civil war in Tigray and escalating conflict on Oromia, Benishangul Gumuz, and other regions over the right of self-determination. It's hard to see how these disputes can be resolved, but at least we can begin to circumscribe the problem. One of the most important but least appreciated arts of governing is the ability to handle radical disagreement and its fellow traveler, systemic uncertainty. In complex societies, it's normal to find a lack of consensus over basic questions such as the identity of the nation and the nature of the state. These are not just disagreements, but radical disagreements. When those who are arguing don't even agree on what they are arguing about, contrary to the assumptions of much political philosophy or political science, there's no requirement for a singular consensus on how to govern, whether it's called a social contract, political settlement, societal ordering, or something else. Policies can still function without them. In fact, they must. Christine Bell has coined the term on governance, and with Jan Prospercil, political unsettlement. And I have outlined a typology of forms of political disorder. This vocabulary isn't familiar to Ethiopia's political class. Too few of them appreciate the arts of managing the incommensurable. They too really acknowledge that indeterminacy, not certitude, is the normal state of political affairs. Since the 1970s, political disputes in Ethiopia have usually been resolved by forms of arms, with force of argument organized in a similar manner, with each party insisting that only their view is correct, and that those who challenge them aren't legitimate. This assumes that a core task of government is to eliminate disorder. Like many other national crises around the world, Ethiopia's conflicts revolve around politicized ethnicity, the constitutional order and models of governance. However, the Ethiopian case is unusual in that it also includes contest over self-determination, a right at once fundamental and elusive. This month, the journal Nations and Nationalism publishes a themed collection in the Nationalism and Self-Determination in the Horn of Africa, co-edited by Sarah Norwin and me. The papers were written 3 years ago. The timeline of academic journals means that the edition is published only now. Our starting point was a reflection on the collection of essays on this topic published almost 40 years ago, edited by the late I.M. Lewis. In those years, nationalists and revolutionaries pursued an array of different political projects, making real diverse forms of self-determination. The same is true today. The circumstances and meanings have to cause change. The Nations and Nationalism collection shows that the Horn of Africa has been a crucible for innovation on both topics with the countries of the region: Djibouti, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan, each having a different framing of what it means to be a nation and different theorizations of self-determination. No legal framing or constitutional order can define the people who are entitled to determine their own future, and any attempt to pin it down flirts with calamity. In our framing article, we write, indeterminate norms can be stronger than concrete ones. Once people insist on rights as defined by a particular rubric, it spells an end to negotiation with one's own constitution and with others. Normally, I would ask them to write a blog post, not least because the current wars in Ethiopia are partially about self-determination. However, as part of the silence imposed on what is probably the largest and most deadly armed conflict in the world today, they are out of contact. The ideology, the theoretical, and the conjunctural political reasons for the ethnic national components of the Federal Constitution of Ethiopia and the ways in which this was implemented over the years of the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Democratic Front and subsequently challenged, they begin with its achievement. The design of the 1995 Federal Constitution of Ethiopia was intended to facilitate the building of a common economic and political community based on the free will of the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia. It is unique in Africa and had no parallels anywhere in the world at the time of its adoption. The practice in the succeeding 2 decades showed that, broadly speaking, Ethiopia underwent a transformation, remaking itself as a multinational state that respects the rights of cultural identities as opposed to its previous definition of a prison of nations. Ethiopia's formerly marginalized cultural communities provided the impetus for a new form of unity based on recognition of rights to self-determination. Mulugeta and Fesheha then identify 3 sets of problems with this arrangement. The first is a failure of theory. This starts with the oddly anachronistic vocabulary of nations, nationalities, and people. Redolent of the former Soviet Union, they write, the problems with the normative framework emanated first from the Leninist-Stalinist theorization of nations, nationalities, and peoples, which never surmounted the contradictions enshrined in Stalin's original formulation. The concept that a nation is constituted by historical processes was never able to prevail over the essentialist notion of a nation as an expression of a primordial national character. We can unpack these 2 sentences. Stalin was tasked by Lenin with formulating a theory and policy for the issues of diversity in the Russian Empire, and he framed a conception of a nation based on ethno-linguistics, homogeneity, common history, and contiguous territory. A second problem is that there were important legislative and procedural gaps for the implementation of internal self-determination short of statehood. This was perhaps inevitable. The rationale for including self-determination in the Constitution was precisely so that when there was a democratic failure at the center, a region was entitled to exercise its democratic rights on its own. The process for doing this was not specified in detail, and perhaps it could not be. The Constitution possessed a crucial, perhaps fatal, probably inescapable gap in specifying the authority for holding regional elections in the absence of authorization from the federal authorities. The administrative procedures for organizing elections obviously should be subordinate to the democratic self-determination norm. Yet, this was not spelled out. presumably because the EPRDF's own democratic failings, while it was in government, were not supposed to be the spark for dissenting regional governments holding elections on their own. In some instances, parties have indeed kept the control over the interpretation to the text, but at a high cost. The idea of an attempt at control is a risk to self-determination in its democratic sense. If parties believe they can control the implementation of the text, how can the political space that self-determination is supposed to create be protected against usurpation by the most political powerful actors? This was the EPRDF's failing, and the one to which the Tigray People's Liberation Front itself fell victim when it lost power at the center. This issue emerged in the debates during 2020 over the postponement of national elections and the TPLF's decision to go ahead nonetheless in Tigray. Marishat Mohammed Hamza has argued that both the federal and Tigray authorities were acting unconstitutionally. This is without doubt the most persuasive argument, partially because there are points of law and procedure on both sides, but more fundamentally because it points to the simple fact that a narrow legalistic interpretation of a contested constitution that doesn't command universal assent, let alone reverence, cannot be the basis for determining right and wrong in an existential debate on the future of the country. The implication is that neither the right of self-determination of groups nor its exercise can be decided by a legal ruling. The legitimacy of claims to self-determination come about through political processes, both dialogue and contestation. In a complex society, we hope that such radical disagreements can be managed through dialogue. The alternative, as Ethiopians are rediscovering, is war. One of the immediate casualties of the Ethiopian war in Tigray is Tigrayans' attack to a common sense of Ethiopian identity. All reports from Ethiopia shows that government rejection of Tigrayans is being reciprocated. Tigrayans no longer feel they are wanted in Ethiopia. The notion Ethiopian is in grave danger of reverting to being identified solely with an Amhara identity and agenda. If the Tigrayans remove themselves from the Ethiopian conversation, others may follow. It will take a leadership of immense civility, courage, and skill to reopen the kind of dialogue necessary for Ethiopians to come together so as to hold their country together. Meanwhile, today's war are sharpening the logic of self-determination exercised by violent means. What began as a breakdown in dialogue is heading towards an existential national crisis. This is where we end today's episode of Editorial. Kindly like, share, comment, let us know your thoughts on this particular episode. Thanks for watching.